Hi, welcome back to Word of Migration, a podcast from the Migration Policy Institute that delves into interesting topics on immigration, integration, and humanitarian protection with some of the world's big thinker, policymakers, and researchers. My name is Camille. I'm your host today, and a senior policy analyst at MPI International Program and an associate director at MPI Europe. And in this episode, we'll take a dive into the refugee situation in Ethiopia, looking more specifically at refugees' access to education and livelihood and what has changed in the past decades. In 2016, Ethiopia was one of the countries that made new pledges regarding the social and economic inclusion of refugees, committing to improve access to the formal labor market and to facilitate refugees' economic inclusion. With my guest, Abis Getachew, we'll discuss how this has played out and what recommendations we can draw for Ethiopia, for other refugee situations around the world. Abis is a researcher on forced migration and has been working in this field for over 10 years. He's a research associate at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, as well as a researcher at Meraki Labs and also at the Refugee-led Research Hubs. Abis, welcome.
Thank you, Camilla.
Thanks. So, Abis, Ethiopia hosts over 800,000 refugees and asylum seekers, mainly from South Sudan, from Somalia, from Eritrea, and the vast majority lives in refugee camps spread across the country, while around 70,000 have settled in the capital, Addis Ababa. I should also say that Ethiopia counts around 4.2 million internally displaced people, known as IDPs. But today we'll be focusing specifically on the refugee situation and not this broader issue of IDPs. And first, I wanted to talk about the access to education for refugees. Children account for a large proportion of the refugee population in the camp. And I wanted to ask you, what is the situation there? Do refugee children have access to schools in the camps or outside the camps?
Thank you, Camille. Maybe we have to divide this question into different subcategories of school, like preschool, primary school, and secondary school. And in the preschool, there is more access, and in the primary, there is as it goes to primary and secondary school, it gets lesser and lesser, especially with the girl students. Now, when we see access to education for the refugees in general, in primary school and secondary school, it is almost less than 50%. And when it comes to the host community, which is closer to 97%. So when we see this gap between the access of education.
So just to specify, Abis, when you say host communities, you're talking about Ethiopians who are living next to these camps, right?
Correct, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So now the refugees have less than 50% of access to education, whereas Ethiopians who are living next to the refugee camps have access to education more than 97%, which is close to 100%. So in order to bring this gap, in order to close this gap, the government, even the East African countries, governments of East African countries have come together with a Djibouti Declaration, which is a declaration that states education of refugees should be handled by the government. So Ethiopia is one of the East African countries that had a parallel system. A parallel system is a system in which refugee education governance is separate to that of the national education governance.
So in other words, Abis, in other words, on the one hand, you had schools in the refugee camps for refugee children, and then you had schools outside for like Ethiopian school with an Ethiopian curricula.
Exactly. The curriculum is the same. However, the governance is different. The Ministry of Education that goes to the regional, to the provincial education bureaus, and that goes all the way to the local administration education bureaus, they are responsible to handle Ethiopians' education. And refugee education is not included in the governance of the Ministry of Education, whereas the refugee education is handled by the UNHCR and other international and local non-governmental organizations.
So we had these two systems, and now you're saying that there was this Djibouti Declaration and that the government of Ethiopia committed to do something else.
Correct. So the government of Ethiopia decided to bring the refugee education under the governance of the Ministry of Education. So this was clearly stated by the Djibouti Declaration, a declaration in which East African governments have decided that refugee education should be handled by the national government. And Ethiopia is one of the signatories of this declaration. So now this declaration started to be implemented in 2017. After 2017, of course, there are so many changes in Ethiopia, especially with the progressive legislation that passed as a refugee proclamation. So according to this proclamation, what has happened is refugee education was handled by the government, and it has given more access to refugees, especially for the refugees' right to education and work.
Can you explain a little bit what was the incentive? What you're describing is a major change in the policies rolled out by the Ethiopian government. Why did the authority take the steps to better include refugees in education?
Exactly, because the number itself speaks. The access to refugee education was less than 50%, whereas the access to education for the Ethiopians in general, it is more than 100%. So even access to education for the Ethiopians who are living close to the refugee camps was way more than that of the refugees. That's why the government had a plan and had initiative to bring the governance of refugee education to the national system, to the governance, to the national system governance.
But so the idea was to improve the education situation for both refugees and the Ethiopians living nearby, right?
Correct. Exactly. That was the plan.
And how does this work?
When it comes to the ground, it's brought that component of quality because refugee education and in the camps was well known by quality and not by access. So the access is less, but the quality was better.
Why was the quality better?
It's a good question. First, it's because the fund that was not coming through the government. It doesn't pass through bureaucratic systems. However, it goes directly to the NGOs and it goes directly to the local NGOs. So there was less bureaucratic path for the funds, and that was the reason for the quality of education. And the reason why access was less has also several reasons of cultural issues of the communities of the refugee communities, especially not allowing some children to send to schools and rather to keep them to work at home. So there were actually different reasons for that.
All right. So you were saying the quality of the school in the refugee camps was better, but then have they merged with the local school managed by the Ethiopians?
Exactly. Now, when the government starts taking care of the schools, now the funds are not coming from the donors directly or from the NGOs directly to the schools, but now it's coming from immediate local administrators or to the lower level of administrations that are called waradas. So from the Ministry of Education, funds go to the regional education bureau, which is a provincial education bureau. From the provincial education bureau, it goes to the lower administration, which is the zonal. From the zonal, it goes to the warada.
So it's a long
now
journey.
When it passes all these bureaucratic steps, exactly through that long journey, the fund gets less and less, and normally there is an attitude from the refugee students that the quality of the host community schools is not as good as the refugee schools, because the refugee teachers who are teaching the refugees were getting a better payment compared to the host community because the funds are coming directly from the donors. And also the monitoring of the teachers in the schools was much better compared to that of the host communities, to the schools that are managed by the government. So now this action to bring schools into the hands of the government became less popular both by the host community, by the Ethiopians, and by the refugees
And
alike.
what was a critique on the side of the Ethiopian? What was a concern on their part?
From the Ethiopians' point of view, there are so many gaps into the education system of the Ethiopians that the government should take care of the Ethiopian education instead of adding up into the education of the instead of handling refugee education. So there is it's a political question that why aren't we get the right attention or the right uh, focus compared to that of the refugees. So that is a question from the Ethiopian side, and from the refugee side, there is an attitude that whenever the government is taking the management of the schools, then the quality of education is going to decline, like the host communities. So
So a lot,
because of this attitude, both the host communities and the refugees.
a lot of tension around this issue, and I mean, you've seen this program, as you've said, since the implementation of this Djibouti Declaration. How have international actors like the World Bank or their development agency been helpful in this process, or try to, promote this integration?
The international organizations such as the World Bank is one of the key stakeholders in the implementation of the Djibouti Declaration, especially in supporting the government to bring to support the refugee education and to handle the refugee education as its own project. So the international community has supported, and at the same time, when the schools that were taken care by the government, because so far there are about 4 schools that are being transferred from the NGOs to the government. So now when these schools are taken care of by the government, now the donors are neglecting these schools and are neglecting in general the refugee education. So that's as the government is taking care of the schools.
So you would say there is a sense that once the school have transition, then they don't get as much support and attention that they had previously, and this is creating this type of mistrust that the international community donors are here to support.
Exactly. Now all the support is coming through the World Bank channel, and the World Bank is communicating at the federal level. And when it comes at the grassroots level, the impact is not seen. Who is supporting which education, and so this creates a grief amongst the grassroots level of the community, that both in the Ethiopians and the refugees.
Thanks for that, and I want to move also. There is this pledge to expand access to education. We've talked about some of the tension around it, but at the time, in 2016, the Ethiopian government had also made big commitment in another area, which was to increase refugee access to the labor market. And on paper, refugees have the right to work, but in practice, again, we've seen it's been much more challenging. So first, can you explain us, Abis, what is the actual policy for refugee in Ethiopia when it comes to working in the formal sector?
One of the difficult things, actually, let me take you back to the education. One of the difficulties in the education system, especially in the refugee education system, is a lack of lack of having a role model amongst refugee students. This is because refugees are not allowed to work, even if the 2019 proclamation, 1110 proclamation, clearly mentions that refugees are allowed to work, but the directive following the proclamation doesn't allow refugees to work. So under this,
there seems to be a disconnect between different texts issued by the government. Is that correct? And how do you explain it?
Exactly. Like the most governing law of the country is a constitution in Ethiopia. So following the constitution, there is a proclamation. So this proclamation shouldn't be in conflict to that of the constitution. And following the proclamation, there is a regulation and a directive. Now, following the refugee proclamation of 2019, there is a directive for the refugees' right to work. But this directive is in contradiction to the proclamation of the 2019. So the 2019 proclamation clearly mentions that refugees are allowed to work, but the directive mentions that the employer of the refugees should have to bring an evidence that the position should not be filled by an Ethiopian. And this is simply saying you cannot work because refugees come to Ethiopia fleeing conflict and different crises, and in Ethiopia had an encampment policy for more than a decade.
Can you just explain what is an encampment policy? What does that mean concretely?
Encampment policy is keeping refugees within the camp and not allowing refugees to go out of the camp,
which makes it difficult to look for a job.
To look for a job, and also to have an experience of the outside world out of the camp. So in order to go out of the camp, there was a strict policy for the refugees. So initially, the idea was to protect the refugees, that they will not go out and will be attacked, and also nobody will come in and will attack them. So initially, it was for the sake of protection, but at the same time, it is
a major
harming them, not to expose them. Exactly.
Abis, allow me to interrupt you. Is that I didn't make a mistake? The 2016 pledges, there was a pledge to allow refugee to work, right? I did not get that. I was just doubting. In 2016, Ethiopia was committing, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
In 2016, Ethiopia was committing to include refugees
to give refugees
in the
right
industry parks.
Okay, super. Parenthesis.
A right to work into the industry park. But that pledge was included into the proclamation in the 2019 proclamation.
Okay.
So Ethiopia adopted that as a law by the parliament, by the national parliament.
Okay. As with education, there's been a role for international actors to support refugee labor market integration, and we've seen how challenging this has been with this legal framework. And this has involved the small-scale initiatives, vocational training, but also more ambitious projects like the Ethiopia Compact that establish industrial zone where refugees, Ethiopian workers can find opportunities. But here again, it seems like the promise has exceeded reality. So far, just a small number of refugees have started to work in this factory. Can you tell us about what this initiative was and what have been, why it has had so limited results?
Number one, Ethiopia is a country with structural unemployment. So it's hard to find unemployment. We can say that unemployment is an issue of not only refugees but also for the Ethiopians. That's something that has to be noted. But when it comes to refugees' access to work into the industrial parks, mainly the compensation that the industry parks were paying were very low.
Can you explain?
Ethiopia has also.
Sorry, Abis. Can you just explain what was the idea with this industrial park? It was to set up industrial park where exactly?
For example, some of the industrial parks were about 250 kilometers out of Addis and very far away from the camps. So number one, refugees should have to get access to these camps, to go out of the camp, access out of the camp, and they have to relocate to these parks, and they were allowed to work. But the compensation is not enough, in which when they are out of the camp, they do not have access to food ration, they do not have access to housing, so they have to finance themselves. So the money that they are getting paid doesn't allow them to fulfill these basic necessities of food and house rent. So because of this,
were people aware?
It simply failed.
Were also people aware of these opportunities? Did they have the skills? How could they get recruited?
Exactly, the recruitment was taking place even from the camps. So when refugees were relocated, actually the Ethiopian government has also been advertising for the inviting foreign investors by saying that Ethiopia is a country of cheap labor, so that you can come to the country and you can get an access of cheap labor, which was under a question. So refugees were also victims of this advertisement, and it didn't sustain because they had access to these jobs, but after 2 months, 3 months, 4, 5, they know that they are not financing themselves with their basic necessities, leave alone saving and changing their lives in going to their dreams. So this was almost getting impossible. So most of them they went back to the camps in which they have access to food ration and housing as well.
We've seen the limitation of this compact, of this initiative with this industrial zones. Is there any place that labor market integration projects are working in terms of vocational training, entrepreneurship support? What has worked for refugees, but also for host communities?
Yeah. For example, the agricultural projects that were taking place in the Somali region, in Dolo Addo zone, were very effective. This is a project that was financed by the IKEA Foundation, and it brings the host communities and the refugees communities together to farm, to engage into the farming projects, and that is a project that is very successful.
Why were they so successful then?
Yeah, the reason why they were successful is number one, they have been highly supported by international NGOs and by UNHCR, and that support was strategic support, and that strategic in a sense, they were highly engaged and they were highly together, and there has been almost a daily follow-up between the INGOs, experts from the INGOs and the farmers themselves. So this was a very effective one, and the other examples that we can take is also the electricity grid project that refugees are
What was that?
working on. So that is also a demand-driven project.
And why was it successful then?
Yes, both the electric grid and the agricultural projects were demand-driven. So they were demanded by the community, and primarily they were demand-driven. And at the same time, there was a close relationship between experts from the international NGOs and local NGOs with the engineers that are working on the electric grids, solar electric grids. So such collaborations and such follow-ups and trainings, like on-the-job trainings, allowed the refugees to be successul in these projects. Both the refugees and the host communities successful.
I see.
The host communities living around the camps.
So here there was a good relationship between the refugees and the communities living around. But as we know, in many countries, labor market integration is often like the top divisive country, and divisive topic, and it can create tensions. And here I want to zoom in on the situation in Gambela, which is a region where there has been this conflict between host and refugee community. And here I want to maybe if you can tell us a bit about what this experience show about the viability of livelihood program, and what other types of intervention are needed.
Thank you for raising this question, Camille, because the successful projects that I was telling you earlier are both in the Somali regions. When we come to the Gambela region now, the story is a bit different. Even when the proclamation in 2019 comes that allows refugees access to land and access to work, primarily the rejection comes from the Gambela region. The reason why it came from the Gambela region is because it has its own history. During the Cold War period, during the Derg regime, while Ethiopia has been under the Derg regime, Ethiopia has been supporting the freedom fighters of the SPLA and has been hosting John Garang's army in Gambela region.
Can you just explain what is the SPLA?
SPLA is Sudan People's Liberation Army. So it is a South Sudanese liberation army.
And so what
fighting
have
for the
been
liberation
what
of
have been the
South Sudan.
effects on the situation in Gambela between how is that having an impact on the relationship between refugees and communities in Gambela today?
So when the SPLA, South Sudan's People Liberation Army, had an opportunity to be hosted by Ethiopia, most of the refugee camps in Ethiopia have been a military bases almost, and they have been recruiting even Ethiopians to fight on behalf of the South Sudanese as well. So because of this reason, Ethiopian Nuers and Ethiopian Anuaks, Anuak is a tribe that is in Ethiopia, largely in Ethiopia, but minority in South Sudan. These tribes, they do not have a trust in the current South Sudan government because they have been recruiting some soldiers from Ethiopia. So whenever there is a kind of integration topic coming from the government, that refugees are going to have access to land and other economic opportunities,
Very
there is
controversial.
a big question mark. Yeah, there is a big question mark that time is going to come, and they are going to be under attack.
I see.
So there is such a fear.
So we see in the end, like a lot of these efforts are going to have, different results, are going to be welcomed differently by the communities, also based on who, where the refugee come from, and what have been their history with the country on the other side of the border. Abis, so I've asked you a lot about international actors and the reason why this matters, because multilateral development bank like the World Bank and development agencies or foundation like you mentioned the IKEA Foundation, they have the resources. And they've deployed a lot of effort to help improve situation in low and middle income country that are host to the world's largest refugee population. And to conclude our conversation today, I wanted to ask you, if you were to, speak to these major players, what are the top 2 or 3 recommendation you would have? What are the 2 or 3 things that they should be prioritizing in order to improve the refugee inclusion into the classroom and in the workplace?
First and foremost, it is good to influence governments. For example, when the government is having, like when the government is not allowing refugees not to work, like is not allowing refugees, like is denying access for the refugees not to work. Of course, there has to be an influence to the governments, but sometimes it's very important on what areas to influence, because now. If we take, for example, access to education, we have to see the history. We have to see what has been on the ground. So in the ground, Ethiopia had 2 systems of education governance.
Yeah.
The refugee education has been governed separately to that of the Ethiopians' education. So now, all of a sudden, when it comes, to a one system governance, it's going to mess up so many things.
So this change
I think the international
this change
community,
takes time.
exactly, it takes time, and like within 5 years or within 3 to 5 years, implementing like or transiting from 2 system governance to one system will mess up so many things. And as we are witnessing at the moment, there it is even creating a conflict between 2 government offices even. So so it is very important to see what has been happening as well. So this is one of my recommendations to the international community.
Thank you for that. And thank you for tuning in to another episode of Word of Migration. If you enjoyed this conversation, please check out other episodes. You can find Word of Migration wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, please leave us a review. And you can find all the episodes for this and other MPI podcasts at MPI website, migrationpolicy.org/podcast. This episode was produced by Abis Getachew and made possible with help from Lisa Dixon and Julian Atten, and editorial input from Michel Middlestadt. Our theme music is called Bright Idea by Geographer. I'm Camille. Thank you again for listening and see you next time.